It began as a story the world wanted to believe had a simple ending. A young champion. A quiet road. A sudden disappearance. But simplicity never survives close inspection, and in 1972, something happened that refused to stay buried. What was first described as an accident would later become one of the most haunting unanswered questions in modern sports history. A case so strange that decades later, investigators would still struggle to explain what truly happened on that night. He was a rising star, admired not just for his talent, but for his discipline, humility, and fierce independence. A man who thrived on movement, speed, and control. The road was his sanctuary. The motorcycle was not just a machine, it was an extension of himself. Friends said he rode with precision, almost spiritual calm. And yet, on one cold evening, that calm vanished into darkness. The night he disappeared was unremarkable at first glance. No storms. No chaos. Just a stretch of road, familiar terrain, and a destination he never reached. Witnesses would later claim they saw him ride past a junction shortly before sunset. Others would swear they heard a motorcycle engine echoing through the hills long after it should have stopped. But none of those accounts would ever align. And that misalignment would become the heart of the mystery. When authorities were alerted that he hadn't returned home, the assumption was immediate. He must have crashed. He must have been thrown from the road. He must be lying somewhere unseen. It was the most comfortable explanation. It required no villains. No secrets. No questions that led anywhere uncomfortable. Search teams were deployed quickly. Helicopters scanned valleys. Volunteers walked embankments. Divers were sent to nearby waters. Every inch of terrain was examined with urgency, because the belief was simple: a body would be found. That belief would prove disastrously wrong. Days passed. Then weeks. Not a trace. No wreckage. No blood. No clothing. No motorcycle. Nothing that confirmed an accident had ever occurred at all. It was as if both man and machine had been erased. That absence disturbed people more than any confirmed tragedy ever could. Because absence leaves space. And space invites questions. Investigators began retracing the final known movements. His last phone call. His last stop. The people he spoke to that day. Every detail, no matter how small, was examined under a growing sense of unease. One fact stood out immediately: he was experienced. Exceptionally experienced. The idea that he could simply lose control without leaving any evidence became harder to accept with every passing day. Friends described him as cautious when it mattered. He knew his limits. He knew the roads. He knew how to read terrain and weather. And on that night, conditions were clear. There was no mechanical issue reported. No erratic behavior observed. So where did he go? As whispers spread, theories began to emerge. Some suggested he staged his own disappearance. That he wanted to escape fame, pressure, expectation. But those closest to him rejected that idea completely. He loved his life. He loved competition. He had future plans, real plans, that required his presence. Walking away made no sense. Others suggested foul play. An argument. A confrontation. A wrong place at the wrong time scenario. But again, there was no evidence. No witnesses willing to come forward. No signs of struggle. The case began to fracture into contradictions. Every explanation created new problems instead of solving old ones. And slowly, quietly, the investigation lost momentum. Files were closed. Leads went cold. And the world moved on. But the silence he left behind never settled. Years later, former investigators would admit something privately they never said publicly. They didn't know what happened. They weren't even sure what they were looking for. The case didn't fail because of lack of effort. It failed because it didn't fit into any known category. Accident didn't work. Disappearance didn't fit. Murder had no proof. And escape didn't align with the man himself. He became a name people spoke softly. A story passed down among athletes, journalists, and fans. A reminder that sometimes, even in the modern world, people can vanish completely. Not metaphorically. Not emotionally. But physically. As if reality itself decided to let go. And the most unsettling question remained unanswered. If he didn't crash? If he didn't leave? If he didn't die where anyone could find him? Then what happened on that road in 1972? Every mystery leaves behind a voice. And his was still waiting to be heard. By the second week after the disappearance, confidence had evaporated. The early certainty that something obvious would turn up was replaced by an uncomfortable realization. Nothing about this case was behaving the way it should. Experienced officers began quietly revisiting their assumptions, asking questions they hadn't wanted to ask at the beginning. The road he was last seen on became the focal point. It was surveyed again, and again, and again. Every bend, every ditch, every tree line. Officers measured distances, angles, and visibility. They looked not just for what should have been there, but for what wasn't. A motorcycle accident, even a severe one, leaves evidence. Skid marks, broken glass, bent metal, oil residue, disturbed soil. Even after time passes, those signatures usually remain. Yet the road told no story at all. It was pristine, untouched, as if no incident had occurred there, ever. That absence forced investigators to confront an uncomfortable truth: either the accident didn't happen on that road, or it didn't happen at all. Attention turned to witnesses. People who lived along the route. Drivers who claimed to have seen him pass. Their statements, once reassuring, began to conflict when placed side by side. One witness claimed the motorcycle engine sounded normal. Another described an unusually loud acceleration. One insisted it was already dark. Another said the sun was still visible. Individually, these inconsistencies meant little. Collectively, they suggested something else entirely. Memory distortion. Assumptions filling gaps. Or worse, people repeating what they believed should have happened rather than what they actually saw. Investigators also examined timing. If he had crashed immediately after being seen, search teams should have found something within hours. If he had ridden farther, why were there no confirmed sightings beyond that point? The timeline simply collapsed under scrutiny. Then there was the motorcycle itself. It was distinctive. Loud. Powerful. Hard to miss. In 1972, such a machine didn't disappear easily. It required space. Transport. Concealment. Someone would have noticed it. Someone would have talked. But no repair shops reported suspicious damage. No scrapyards logged unusual parts. No tips surfaced about a motorcycle being sold, hidden, or destroyed. That silence was deafening. As weeks turned into months, theories grew bolder. Investigators began quietly entertaining ideas they would never put in writing. One of them involved deliberate removal. Not by accident. Not by chance. But by intent. If someone wanted both a man and a motorcycle to vanish, it would require planning. Knowledge of the area. Access to equipment. And above all, time. That raised the possibility that whatever happened did not happen quickly. It happened deliberately. Another line of inquiry focused on his personal life. Finances. Relationships. Professional pressures. Fame is a strange burden, especially for someone who prefers solitude. But again, nothing supported the idea of escape. Bank accounts were untouched. No documents were missing. No foreign activity appeared later. He did not resurface under another identity. The world had truly lost him. Years later, a retired officer would admit something chilling. The case never officially shifted from accident to criminal investigation, but informally, many investigators had already done so. They just couldn't prove it. And without proof, the system stalled. Files were archived. Evidence was boxed. Leads were marked exhausted. But the unanswered questions remained alive, circulating quietly among those who had worked the case. They spoke about it late at night. Over drinks. In moments of honesty they never shared publicly. What bothered them most was not what they knew, but what didn't make sense. People don't vanish this completely by mistake. And as the years passed, something else emerged. New technology. New forensic methods. New perspectives. And with them, whispers began to surface that the original investigation may have missed, or ignored, critical details. Details that, if examined today, might tell a very different story. Because sometimes, the truth doesn't disappear. It waits. And this case was far from finished. Decades passed, and with them came silence. But silence, in cold cases, is never empty. It stores pressure. It preserves mistakes. And when the right moment comes, it releases everything at once. In the late 1990s, a quiet review began. Not a reopening. Not an announcement. Just a reassessment requested by someone who hadn't been there the first time. A fresh pair of eyes. No emotional attachment to early conclusions. No loyalty to old assumptions. The first thing that stood out was the original accident narrative. It had been accepted too quickly. In the early days, investigators were under pressure. A famous disappearance attracts attention. and attention demands answers. An accident was neat. It was believable. It allowed the public to grieve without asking uncomfortable questions. But when modern analysts reconstructed the scenario, cracks appeared immediately. The motorcycle model was studied again. Its fuel capacity. Its mechanical limits. Its typical engine behavior at different speeds. Experts recreated the ride digitally, factoring in terrain, incline, and weather conditions from that night. What they found was unsettling. If the rider had continued at the speed witnesses suggested, he would not have needed to slow down where he supposedly disappeared. The road ahead was clear. Visibility was sufficient. There was no mechanical reason for a sudden loss of control. Then came the weather records. On the night in question, conditions were stable. No rain. No fog. No sudden temperature drop. The road surface was dry. The dangerous driving conditions explanation quietly collapsed under scrutiny. Attention shifted to the search itself. In 1972, search operations were limited by technology. No thermal imaging. No drones. No satellite assistance. But even by those standards, the coverage should have produced something. A helmet. A boot. A fragment of metal. Something. It didn't. Modern investigators ran simulations using updated search modeling. Based on human physiology and terrain decay patterns, they calculated where remains or debris should have surfaced over time if an accident had occurred. The result was chilling. Statistically, something should have been found within the first year. The absence of evidence was no longer neutral. It was suspicious. That realization triggered a deeper dive into overlooked details. A logbook entry from the original investigation surfaced, barely noticeable. It mentioned a vehicle seen parked off-road near the disappearance window. At the time, it was dismissed as unrelated. Rural roads often attract parked cars. But when re-examined, the detail became critical. The vehicle was described as large enough to transport a motorcycle. That single line changed everything. Investigators traced ownership records from the area. Old registrations. Scrapped vehicles. Rentals. The trail was cold, but not entirely dead. One name surfaced repeatedly. Not as a suspect. As someone present. Someone who lived nearby. Someone who had access to equipment, storage, and time. This individual had been interviewed briefly in the original investigation. Their statement was short. Cooperative. Forgettable. They were never revisited. Why? Because in 1972, there was no evidence tying them to anything. And once the accident narrative took hold, alternative explanations lost urgency. But now, viewed through a modern lens, that early dismissal looked premature. Another breakthrough came from an unexpected place, public memory. A researcher reviewing archived newspapers noticed letters sent to editors years after the disappearance. Not tips. Not accusations. Just observations. Locals questioning why no debris was ever found. Why certain areas were never searched. Why the case was allowed to fade. At the time, these letters were ignored. Today, they read like warnings. The most disturbing realization came last. If the disappearance had involved another party, even briefly, then the window of opportunity was small. That suggested proximity. Familiarity. Someone who didn't panic. Someone who knew how to act quickly. Someone who didn't expect to be questioned again. The case was no longer about what happened on the road. It was about what happened after. And that distinction mattered. Because accidents end quickly. But cover-ups require calm. And as the modern review quietly expanded, investigators began to suspect that the most important part of the story had never been told, not because it was hidden well, but because no one had been looking in the right direction. Until now. Reopening a cold case isn't about finding new facts first. It's about reinterpreting old ones without fear. When investigators revisited the people closest to the disappearance, they weren't looking for guilt. They were looking for behavior. What people said. What they avoided. What no one thought to question because it felt impolite, or unnecessary, or too late. The individual connected to the parked vehicle became the quiet center of attention. Not publicly. Not officially at first. Just internally. In 1972, this person had lived within minutes of the road. They owned tools. Storage space. A utility vehicle. None of that was suspicious on its own. In rural communities, it was common. What mattered now was opportunity paired with absence. On the night of the disappearance, this person claimed they were home. Alone. No witnesses. No corroboration. At the time, that was enough. Now, it wasn't. Investigators reconstructed their timeline. Employment records, utility usage, old phone logs, even grocery receipts preserved in archives. The goal wasn't to prove wrongdoing, but to test consistency. Small inconsistencies appeared. Nothing dramatic. No smoking gun. Just moments that didn't align as cleanly as memory suggested. A fuel purchase logged at a station farther away than claimed. A neighbor who remembered hearing a vehicle late that night, though they couldn't identify whose. A casual remark made years later in a social setting that contradicted the original statement. Individually, these details meant nothing. Together, they formed a shape. Then came the psychological review. Modern cold case teams often involve behavioral analysts, not to profile criminals, but to evaluate reactions over time. How people talk about events decades later can reveal more than what they said initially. Archived interviews were reviewed. Voice tone, word choice, emotional distance. The individual never expressed grief. Not fake grief. Not suppressed grief. Just, none. They spoke about the disappearance as an inconvenience to the community, a disruption, a strange event, but never as a tragedy involving a human being. That absence stood out, especially given how deeply the disappearance affected others. Another detail resurfaced. In the months following the disappearance, this same person had unexpectedly cleared out a storage structure on their property. The structure was later demolished. At the time, it was attributed to routine maintenance. No one documented what had been inside. No one thought to. Until now. Investigators examined aerial photographs from the era. Low-resolution images, grainy and imperfect, but revealing. The structure was visible in earlier photos. In later ones, it was gone. The timing aligned uncomfortably well with the disappearance. Ground-penetrating radar was considered but ultimately ruled out. Too much time had passed. Too many changes to the land. If something had been hidden, it was no longer there. That raised a troubling possibility. If the disappearance was not an accident, and if evidence had once existed, then it had been moved. Which meant the truth wasn't buried. It had traveled. Attention shifted beyond the immediate area. Nearby counties. Old landfills. Abandoned properties. Places that would have been accessible in the hours after the disappearance, not days later. Investigators followed disposal patterns from similar historical cases. Where people took things when they didn't want them found. Rivers. Industrial sites. Construction zones. One location appeared repeatedly in their analysis. A quarry. Inactive now. Flooded. Forgotten. But in 1972, it had been active. Accessible. And used by locals who knew its blind spots. Records showed the individual had legitimate reasons to be there at the time. Work-related. That detail alone didn't prove anything. But it erased coincidence. When investigators contacted the individual decades later, the conversation was polite. Controlled. Almost rehearsed. They denied involvement. They denied knowledge. They denied remembering much at all. But when asked about the quarry, there was a pause. Just a pause. Barely noticeable. But pauses matter. Because memory fades naturally. Reactions don't. The case still lacked physical proof. That hadn't changed. What had changed was confidence. The original certainty that this was an accident was gone. In its place stood a more uncomfortable conclusion. This disappearance had been shaped by human choice. And if choices were made, then responsibility existed. The question was no longer what happened. It was why no one saw it coming. For decades, the case lived in a gray space between rumor and resignation. No body. No confession. No crime scene. Just absence. And absence, in law, is often treated as uncertainty. But something changed when investigators stopped asking where the missing Olympic champion went, and started asking who benefited from their disappearance. That shift altered everything. Financial records, long ignored because the individual was assumed dead by accident, were re-examined with modern forensic accounting tools. Old bank statements were digitized. Insurance policies were pulled from paper archives. Pension records resurfaced. And there it was. A life insurance policy. Not unusual. But the timing was. The policy had been quietly updated less than a year before the disappearance. The beneficiary was someone close. Someone trusted. Someone who had never publicly spoken about the loss. The payout wasn't immediate. It took years. Legal delays. Presumptions of death. Bureaucratic hurdles. But eventually, the money was released. No one questioned it at the time. Now, investigators did. They traced how the funds were used. Property purchases. Business investments. A sudden improvement in lifestyle that had never been explained by income alone. Still, money alone doesn't prove murder. But it proves motive. At the same time, advancements in forensic geology opened a door no one expected. Samples taken decades earlier from the abandoned vehicle, dust trapped beneath floor mats, residue on tires, were compared to soil compositions from multiple locations. One match stood out. Not definitive, but statistically improbable to be random. The quarry. The same quarry investigators had flagged based on behavioral analysis. It wasn't proof, but it was alignment. And alignment, in cold cases, is powerful. Authorities faced a difficult decision. Without remains, they couldn't prosecute. Without prosecution, they risked criticism. But ignoring the evidence was no longer defensible. They did something rare. They reclassified the case. What had once been labeled a mysterious disappearance was officially reopened as a suspected homicide. The announcement didn't come with accusations. No names were released. But the implication was unmistakable. The public reaction was immediate. News outlets resurrected headlines from the 1970s. Former teammates gave interviews for the first time in decades. Journalists asked questions that had never been asked aloud. And then, something unexpected happened. A witness came forward. Not someone new. Someone old. A person who had lived with a memory too heavy to carry alone. In 1972, they had seen something near the quarry. A vehicle. Late. Unusual. But they were young. Unsure. Afraid of being wrong. So they stayed quiet. Until now. Their account didn't provide a confession. It didn't reveal a body. But it corroborated the timeline investigators had reconstructed. For the first time, the story made sense. Not as a tragedy of chance, but as a sequence of decisions. When authorities interviewed the individual connected to the evidence again, the tone was different. Firmer. More direct. They presented what they had. The financials. The soil analysis. The witness statement. Still, there was no confession. But there was fear. And fear is often the last thing left when the truth has nowhere else to hide. Legally, the case remained unresolved. But publicly? It was no longer a mystery. The narrative had shifted from what happened to who was responsible. And even without handcuffs, even without a courtroom, something irreversible had occurred. The missing Olympic champion had been heard. Their story, once reduced to a footnote, now stood as a warning. That time does not erase truth. It only waits. When a case reaches this point, where the truth is understood but justice cannot be enforced, it leaves behind a different kind of ending. Not a verdict. Not a sentence. But a reckoning. Authorities never announced an arrest. They never stood behind a podium and said the words people waited for. The law had limits, and time had protected the guilty in ways no statute could undo. But something more powerful than a trial had happened. The story had been corrected. For years, the Olympic champion's disappearance had been framed as an unfortunate accident. A wrong turn. A tragic miscalculation. That version of events had allowed everyone involved to move on comfortably. Now, that comfort was gone. Official records were amended. Public statements were revised. The case file, once thin and speculative, was reclassified to reflect the reality investigators now accepted. This was not an accident, and it was not random. It was intentional. For the family, this shift meant everything. They had lived with doubt for decades. Doubt about what happened. Doubt about whether they had failed to ask the right questions. Doubt about whether the world had already forgotten. When investigators sat down with them and explained the findings, carefully, respectfully, the reaction was not anger. It was relief. Because certainty, even without punishment, is a form of justice. Memorials followed. Not dramatic ones. Not monuments of stone. But gestures that carried weight. The athlete's name was formally reinstated in historical records. Achievements once overshadowed by mystery were restored to their rightful place. A scholarship was created in their honor. Not for athletes alone, but for students studying ethics in sports, decision-making under pressure, and the responsibility that comes with public trust. The message was clear: greatness is not just about winning. It's about what you protect, and who you refuse to sacrifice. The individual long suspected never faced charges. But they faced something else. Isolation. Friends distanced themselves. Conversations ended abruptly. Invitations stopped coming. The community that once shielded them now regarded them with quiet clarity. No accusations were spoken aloud. None were needed. History had made its judgment. And then, something subtle but profound happened. Other cold cases, once dismissed as accidents, were reopened across the country. Investigators cited this case as a turning point. As proof that long-held assumptions deserve scrutiny, no matter how much time has passed. Families who had been told there's nothing more we can do were contacted again. Because now, there was. This case didn't end with handcuffs. It ended with truth. And truth has a way of changing the future, even when it can't change the past. The Olympic champion is no longer remembered for how they vanished. They are remembered for what their story revealed. That silence is never neutral. That justice delayed is not justice denied, if the truth is finally spoken. And that every mystery leaves behind a voice. And today, we heard it.